I'm going to read you a passage from the Dhammapada, this great sort of corpus of teachings by the Buddha. Um, and this is apparently a slight adaptation by Thomas Byrom. I haven't compared it to the original text, but the spirit of this, I appreciate, I value the spirit of how Thomas Byrom has translated this, and it also speaks to the theme tonight of abandoning the sorrow and the roots of sorrow, of suffering. There is no fire like greed, no crime like hatred, no sorrow like separation, no sickness like hunger of heart, and no joy like the joy of freedom. Health, contentment, and trust are your greatest possessions, and freedom is your greatest joy. Thus, look within, be still, free from fear and clinging, and simply know the sweet joy of living in the way. So I'm going to share with you a practice. What we're going to do is practice a bit first, and then we will enter into this section of the Majjhima Nikaya, one of the great middle discourse texts of the Tripitaka, or the three baskets. And the sutras are one of the great sort of three baskets of texts in Buddhism. And Majjhima Nikaya are sort of one of the longer texts, but they also are mid-length discourses. It's a very long text. A lot of the texts in that, or the sutras in that text, involve mind, consciousness, and so on. And what we're going to be looking at is one part of that text where the Buddha teaches on 7 ways of abandoning suffering, or as it's translated here in my version, sorrow. And it's a very seldom known passage, but I think really instructive, really helpful. Because the Buddha is encouraging us not just to basically attend to suffering with compassion, with mindfulness, with loving kindness, and so on. Yes, those are extremely important, but there are other ways to guard our introspection, in the words of Shantideva, or to ensure that we remain on the path in a wholesome way. So I love this text, and I'm happy to share it with you all. This part of this text now that we're kind of looking at tonight in the Majjhima Nikaya, we should remember that the Buddha is largely here speaking to monastics, as he does in many of the sutras from the Pali Canon. And yet that doesn't mean we can't actually learn even more about wise discernment by how we might sort of relate to suffering, relate to sorrow, lamentation, as he says in the Satipatthana Sutra. And when he talks about mindfulness in that text, he's encouraging us to practice as a way to cease or experience the cessation of suffering and sorrow and lamentation. And so you have this sense in this text as well that this notion of sorrow is very much a part of the human experience of suffering, of the second arrow, if you will. This notion that the first arrow of suffering is inevitably something that takes all of us, right? The illness, injury, old age, death, and so on. And then the second arrow is really kind of the anguish we go through, the mental suffering because of that first arrow. So what he tells us is this practice of abandoning, quote unquote, abandoning suffering or abandoning sorrow is really about wisdom. It is about wise discernment. It is about knowing the difference between whether you need to actually respond to the source of suffering, a situation or another person, or respond in a different way, which may be one of these other 7 ways. The reason that there is a little confusion about whether there are 6 or 7 ways, this is just a side note here, is that in the introductory paragraph of this text, and I don't know if it's the translators that I've looked at, they only account for 6, but when you actually read the text, there is a 7th in there. So I'm not sure exactly what causes that discrepancy. So I'm going to go through these sort of 7 other ways of attending to difficulty, to suffering, and this discernment we need to basically cut the roots of suffering, basically for good, away on the path so as to have more balance and continue to cultivate a path that is really getting us somewhere. Yeah. So the first one, so how monks do, and nuns and bhikkhus and bhikshunis, how do we practice these ways of abandoning sorrow? In fact, of course, there's a refrain, as there are in many of these texts. Oh, that's the parable of the mustard seed. Hang on. It's another good one, but that's for another time. Here we go. So this is sort of the intro of this section. Thus I have heard, this is how many of the sutras begin, the stories in the sutras, because texts were originally passed down through hearing. They were passed down orally. And so sort of the unbroken line of the Buddha's teachings were things that were heard properly and accurately, to preserve the teachings. So thus have I heard, once in the Jeta Grove, the Buddha addressed the monastics thus. I say that the elimination of the causes of sorrow is for one who knows and sees wisely, not for one who does not know and see wisely. Then he goes on and describes the first one. And the first one is not paying attention. Why on the earth would the Buddha tell us to not pay attention? Aren't we supposed to be cultivating a heightened clarity and an attentiveness and an attentiveness? After all, mindfulness, shamatha, vipassana, just about every practice is about quality of attention. And what he's talking about here by not paying attention, he's basically saying you have a choice here. He's talking about, in many ways, Shantideva, the way that we discussed mindfulness several weeks ago, guarding introspection. He tells us to basically guard the mind against dwelling on things, ruminating, fixating, what in some cases we would call perseverating, where the mind is just this constant wheel of, what's the word, starts with a C, like, anyway, there's a word I can't pull up, but basically ruminating constantly. He said certain things we have to just pull ourselves away from and not think about. So in this case, non-attending, not feeding the ruminating and the dwelling, not fighting it either. Just knowing whether something that you might contemplate is fit for your attention or unfit. And part of the brilliance here, I think, is he is prizing this genuine, precious nature of attention. Remembering, too, that in English, this word attending comes from caring for, attending to. I believe there's a Latin root here where attention is caring for something. And so I feel like part of this is that your attention is precious, not to squander it on wasteful thinking, on just the stories, the narratives that hijack our attention and become like poison. Yeah. Those are the things that are quote unquote unfit for our attention. And in each of these things, there is a quality or a trait we can say that this is the point here of practice. So not paying attention is really about focus. On what am I focusing? This is me. This isn't what the Buddha says. But this is one way to interpret not paying attention. He says in this text, there are causes and forms of sorrow that should be abandoned by not paying attention to them. This, when I first read this was not intuitive from a Buddhist sense, but it kind of makes sense. After all, I had a teacher years ago who said it's better just to not waste your energy on certain things, certain thoughts. I was talking to someone earlier today about my family is just, we're all news junkies. We were raised with really being concerned about current events and politics and what is happening in the world, but to a point where you're just constantly looking at news or checking up on things. I've really had to try to cut, sort of to not pay attention because of the narratives that it begins to create. And we've kind of talked about this before here on this call. So that's the first one. This sense of not paying attention actually is a guarding of the precious nature of our attention, not to forget. Yeah. And when we can relate to our own mind with mindfulness, after all, mindfulness is memory, it is remembering. The Pali term for mindfulness, sati, or the Sanskrit term smriti, is remembering. And here, this is about remember. You don't need to pay attention to this necessarily. Now, this doesn't mean we don't care about what's happening in the world, but it's just really about caring for our attention and knowing when something is not fit, when it's not worthy of the precious nature of your attention. The second one, restraint. So relating to the cause of sorrow with restraint. In other words, not giving in to perhaps what the impulse is trying to teach us. And here he's really talking about sensory restraint, not getting lost in the senses, whether they're pleasurable or unpleasant, which itself can lead to the first one, it can lead to rumination and so on. And what we're talking about here is stability and the precepts that we covered several weeks ago. What we sometimes might call the ethical restraints. Yeah, things like not killing, not lying, not stealing, not misusing sexuality, not taking intoxicants or misusing intoxicants if we're talking about lay people, and so on. And those are all seen to be restraints that basically are really important to maintain a sense of clarity and wholesomeness on the path. Yeah? And so part of this is non-clinging. And the corresponding trait that I have come up with here is that restraint implies agency. It implies a sense of self-determination, that we have choice. In fact, all of these imply a sense of choice. And discernment, or what is called wise discernment, is knowing what is not fit for my attention in the first case, and here in this case, knowing what is not fit for my action. So we go from attention here to action, to restraining from indulging. And that requires a certain sense of agency. It requires some sense of control, if you will, although not in the sense of control that is full of striving and neurotic control, but rather a sense of wisdom, of wise discernment that I have agency here and I don't need to have that donut, even though I kind of want it still. Um, the third way of abandoning sorrow, if you will, and interestingly, he uses the word abandoning. What we're talking about here, in a way, is renunciation. A renunciation of traits, basically, that we know through our wise discernment are unwholesome, that they don't help on the path, and they don't help with the practice. The third one is called using. What on earth does that mean? Using what? Well, using the resources of our lives in moderation, such as food. Here, food isn't about stimulus-driven pleasure. It's not about gaining comfort if we're grieving. It's not about all that, but it is simply about nourishment. It's about keeping the body healthy and fit for cultivating, for meditation, for the path, for the path of the Bodhisattva, if we're in Mahayana tradition. And it's not necessarily escaping through things like beauty. So he's saying just this renunciation of the aesthetic, of the sort of the superfluous, or intoxicants. And those are things he names here as well. Not giving in to over comfort, overly clinging to comfort in our lives. A home is a dwelling space that gives you a place to practice, to cultivate freely. Yeah. And I don't know how many of you can identify with this, but I'm always thinking of ways, how can, my living situation, my spaces be improved to feel better, to get that sort of pleasurable feeling. Oh, if I add another plant here, or, I clean out this corner and put something else there, there's this constant like striving to have even more, my home be even more of a paradise. That's not so unusual. I think a lot of people can relate to that, perhaps. What he's saying is, don't get so caught up, because that too is the root of sorrow. We will never be fully satisfied. I can only imagine what it would be like to build my own house and then keep putting additions onto it everywhere. Putting a gazebo in the garden where I can just sit and meditate and leave this rest of this enormous house for someone else to live in. And then, it just doesn't end. And so part of that is, what he's saying is that whatever the possessions are that we have, the blessings of food, of comfort, of having a place to live, are really about cultivating healthy and good habits. Habits conducive to a sense of freedom, not habits that are conducive to even more entanglement and even more bondage. So knowing the difference between these two things. So this kind of innocuous word, using, yes, it means all that. And what I feel like sort of the attending state to that would be motivation. Knowing my motivation is the reason that I need to improve my environment, coming from a place of needing an unfulfilled sacred space that ever more feels like heaven or Sukhavati, a heavenly realm? Or is it utilitarian? Nothing wrong with having flowers and plants and pictures on the wall and all of those things that remind us of beauty and of things that make us comfortable. But I think what he's talking about here really is just mind your motivation, because that clinging can get away from us and we don't even know it. And so if we want to attend to the cause of sorrow that is steeped in overindulgence, then we need to be mindful of our motivation and have wise discernment to know when this is happening and when is it actually meeting a really good need for us to have healthy and good habits. So that's this third one of using. The fourth one, sometimes we just need to endure. How many of you have heard the Buddha's teaching on this? Sometimes it's not about even accepting things as they are or loving all of the mud that gives rise to the lotus. Yes, these are true teachings. But here he says sometimes we just need to endure. If you've known anybody who has gone through serious chronic pain or who have migraines or have been through an illness or a time following an injury where there's been a lot of recovery and so on, there are words that cannot help because the pain is too bad. And I used to experience this doing the chaplaincy at Dana Farber years ago. Sometimes people would have, one of the worst kinds of physical pain is nerve pain. If anybody's experienced nerve pain, it's really, there's no relief from it, and not very easily. And so how do you guide someone through a meditation that's experiencing nerve pain? Well, you can't. When the pain is too bad, sometimes you simply cannot practice. And so they used to have what are called adult coloring books for people just to get through the pain. And there was this one person I remember, she would make these incredibly talented works of art they would be like coloring books for grown-ups with these incredible black and white lines, these images, and she made them into these beautiful works of art. All of it was an expression of pain, or at least expression of enduring her pain. It was really quite remarkable that even in the midst of that, she could be creative. Now, what the Buddha was talking about when it comes to enduring, yes, he does mention pain, achiness in the body, pain, and conditions. Now, remember how the Buddha's followers, this community, they were wandering and they were exposed to the elements constantly. Cold, heat, hunger. Insects are mentioned frequently in the texts. Even the word creeping things, quote unquote, is in the text. We have to endure creeping things. That's not easy for some of us, right? How many of you just find creeping things to be like the worst thing you might encounter in your home? Yeah. So, and the fact that it's nondescript can conjure up all kinds of things, right? Creeping things. We have these great imaginations. Wind, rain, sun, and as well as ill-spoken words or unwholesome words that have been said to us. Even things that we feel that other people have said, sometimes the only response is to endure. And so these are all things he names in this text. The corresponding qualities that I'm taking from that passage are things like heartiness or hardiness. I think there's similarity between heartiness and hardiness. In essence, perhaps what we might call resilience, a sense of resilience. And again, the wise discernment is knowing when simply you just need to endure something until you can actually respond skillfully and turn something perhaps into something wholesome on the path. That's interesting, right? Because we don't often hear this about the Buddhist teaching. The fifth one, and this is the one that was left out of the introductory section of the version of the text that I have. This might surprise some of you. Avoidance. Really? The Buddha's telling us to avoid something? Yes. Such as wild elephants, dogs, wild boars, snakes, tree stumps, bramble patches. Please, everyone, avoid these things. Okay? Chasms, cliffs, cesspits, and sewers. unsuitable chairs, and associating with unwholesome people. Um, so the part of this I think that is interesting to me is the avoiding association with unwholesome people. The other stuff, okay, it makes sense. In other words, he's saying avoid things that are dangerous to you or that will cause great harm and great discomfort. Don't fall off a cliff. Don't fall into a chasm. Take care of yourself so that you can continue to practice in this precious human lifetime. But associating with unwholesome people, you would think that, if you are at some point on the path, you would be able to approach unwholesome people and say something really smart and wise and Buddhist and maybe start changing their minds. And in some cases, who knows, that may be possible. But he's saying for your benefit, you don't want to be led into sort of manipulative situations where you will be in danger. My teacher, Leslie, she used to occasionally say that if you live next to a neighbor who is constantly bringing you down, and you're at home and you're maybe on personal retreat and you're meditating and you go out and this person is not healthy to talk to, better to avoid this person altogether. This is what she said. As opposed to go rush in, show them how spacious and loving you are, and then come away from it holding this. Largely, the reason behind this is again, it's the precious nature of your mind, of your attention, of your energy. And it's conserving your energy for things, for people, for situations where you can really be of benefit. So again, remembering that this is sort of an instruction for living a life on the path of some kind, or how to put your practice into practice off the cushion. Yeah. I feel like the corresponding trait here is that you do have choices in where you go and where you place yourself. Yeah. And I think part of the wise discernment here is knowing what he's saying is knowing the difference. Now, you may be starting to get a sense here, wow, this is starting to feel a little challenging to know the difference between when to do all of these different things. So as much as they may seem reasonable, we may understand each of these categories. It may not be so easy to apply sort of skillful discernment and say, okay, here, this I just need to endure. Or if we're helping someone else, if we're in a position as a therapist or a counselor or a chaplain, when to advise sort of inquiry into how someone is, quote unquote, using, yeah, or avoiding that kind of thing. So this too is its own sort of pathway in practice. The sixth one, we're getting there, is removing. Removing. What are we supposed to remove? Are we getting rid of old clothes in the closet that we don't wear? Are we sort of removing objects from our lives? Well, perhaps. But what he's talking about here are really, first of all, creating a sense of intolerance. Intolerance to our own craving and the way that the three poisons show up in our own lives: greed, hatred, and delusion. So he names especially craving and clinging thoughts, ill will and cruelty, abandoning the habits. I think this is one of the hardest on this list. And yet, if I were going to sort of bring a positive spin to this one, I think that the corresponding point of practice here would be empowerment. Basically, we are empowered. We have the power to do this. We have choices in all of these. And this one, it may be that this kind of the truth of neuroplasticity, that we can change our habits, right? That can take time. The point here is not to give in to those tendencies, to things like cruelty or ill will or judgmental thinking. This is all natural, after all. He's not saying that we are, quote unquote, evil for doing these things. This is what the ordinary mind does. And so if we want to cultivate a sense of renunciation to the things that cause us suffering and sorrow, by removing these kinds of patterns in our thinking, of habit patterns, we start to experience a sort of a tremendous sense of freedom. Imagine not being bound to those the sort of the negative projections onto other people. You're not going to be any less safe because you're bringing wise discernment. I think sometimes this sort of need, the lizard brain or the amygdala, kind of like the threat assessment, even around social circumstances, what Stephen Porges calls neuroception, this interesting term around fear response as it arises in social situations. That our vagal tone just increases exponentially when we feel unsafe or in social situations. And yet, how we relate to that feeling itself, this is the work of mindfulness. Interestingly, if you bring mindfulness into each and every one of these things, there may be a real sense of liberative wisdom that comes by saying, okay, how do I apply mindfulness to non-attention? How do I apply mindfulness to restraint? How do I apply it to using, and so on and so forth? If we had more time, we could do that here together. But maybe that's your homework if you're interested in this theme. Okay, we could have another part 2 session on this if you find this interesting. And then we come to the 7th, the last one, and this is where he gives us the good news. How to abandon or renounce the causes of our sorrow or our suffering by, quote unquote, developing what? The 7 factors of awakening. He names these in the text. The 7 factors of awakening, these qualities that we find in the Satipatthana Sutra, the teaching on mindfulness, the 10th discourse by the Buddha. And so here is where he says, developing, number 1, mindfulness. Number 2, investigation, or what is also called vipassana, or insight into the nature of suffering and the underlying nature of mind itself. Energy is the 3rd one. What's called rapture or joy. Rapture is kind of a funny term here, but because it's really a sense of deep contentment, tranquility, concentration, and equanimity. So for those of you who have studied with me the Satipatthana Sutra, you've heard these 7 factors of awakening before. He's saying that in this text, developing these is kind of like, that's like the last stage here. That uprooting the causes of suffering, sorrow, lamentations, and such, by focusing, by cultivating, and that, by the way, would be the attending quality, cultivation to this developing. It also helps remind us again of why we are cultivating wise discernment in the first place, for ultimate liberation, for nibbana or nirvana, for freedom.